The night Vanessa laughed across the table and called me a bad businessman, that was the night I decided to let her write the opening act of her own downfall. It was September 12th, 2018, Dallas, Texas. Still hot enough that the air outside clung to your skin like syrup. Inside the Mercury Grill, the AC was set too low, and the white tablecloths practically glowed under the recessed lighting. Vanessa sat across from me, swirling a glass of Sauvignon Blanc like she owned the place. Technically, she did own half of what paid for the dinner. My company. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Grant Logistics was 24 years old that summer. I'd built it from two leased trucks and a fax machine in my father's garage. By 2018, it had ballooned into a $900 million enterprise, a regional freight powerhouse with a seat at every serious industry table. Vanessa had been with me through most of it, co-founder, strategist, and until 2016, my wife. We were divorced now, but still bound together by contracts, shares, and history. And that night, I thought maybe we could behave like adults. Just dinner. Just two people with shared history. But betrayal never announces itself with a drum roll. It comes in sideways. She leaned back, let out a small laugh, and said, "You were never a businessman, Wilder. You were just lucky." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the casual cruelty. I stared at her for a moment, letting the silence hang. "Lucky?" I repeated slowly. She smirked. "You got in early. You had Martin. You had me. You coasted." Martin Alvarez, our CFO, had been with me since '99, loyal to the bone. And Vanessa, well, she wasn't wrong about her role in the early years. But the way she said it, like I was some accidental passenger on my own ship, cut deeper than I expected. I forced a thin smile. "I built this company with my hands, Vanessa. You know that." She shrugged, sipped her wine. "Sure, you were good at the grunt work. But vision? Strategy? You never had that. That sip's why things are stale now. And frankly, the board sip's starting to notice. That last sentence wasn't an offhand jab. It was a test. I would have brushed it off, chalked it up to her usual post-divorce needling, if not for what happened next. She opened her clutch to grab her phone, and a folded wire transfer slip slid out, fluttering onto the floor beside her chair. I bent down automatically to pick it up. She didn't even notice. Redwood Meridian LLC, $2,800,000, Grand Cayman Bank. The date was August 31st, 2018, just 2 weeks earlier. My heart kicked once. Hard. I glanced up. Vanessa was texting, laughing at something on her screen, completely oblivious to what had fallen. I tucked the slip under my napkin without a word. That piece of paper changed everything. Driving home down Central Expressway that night, I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The city lights blurred through the windshield. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was processing. Vanessa mocking me was one thing. A $2.8 million Cayman transfer tied to an unfamiliar LLC. That was strategy. The laugh had been personal. The slip was corporate warfare. I pulled into my driveway a little past 11 p.m. The house was silent. Julia wasn't in my life yet. Ryan, our son, was away at grad school. It was just me, the ticking of the kitchen clock, and that slip of paper spread out on the counter under the harsh overhead light. I read it over and over. Redwood Meridian, Cayman, $2.8 million. Vanessa had always been ambitious, but after the divorce she set grown sharper, colder. She started courting new investors, modernizers, she called them, people who loved her charm and her talk of shaking up old world logistics. And apparently she'd started moving money offshore. I slipped the receipt into a file folder, labeled it with the date, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my study desk. I even underlined the date twice. I didn't know the whole game yet, but I knew this much. She'd made her opening move. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, sat in my leather chair, and replayed the dinner in my head. Her tone, her smirk, the transfer slip. She thought I was a bad businessman. She thought I'd roll over, like always. She had no idea that she'd just handed me the thread I'd spend the next 6 years pulling. I slept little that night. When I did drift off, it was to the sound of imaginary boardroom whispers and Cayman Bank stamps. Something had shifted. The woman who'd once helped me build my legacy had quietly started trying to rewrite it without me. And I decided in that silence that I wouldn't fight her with noise. I'd fight her with patience. Every betrayal has a beginning. That night at the Mercury Grill was hers, and mine. Grief doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it shows up as silence that eats your house alive. By the time the holidays rolled around in December 2019, the house felt like a mausoleum. Grant Logistics headquarters, the building I'd once called my second home, wasn't much better. Both spaces echoed with the same thing: absence. Ryan had graduated and was splitting his time between a sustainability fellowship in Austin and weekends with his friends. Julia wasn't in the picture yet, and Vanessa, well, Vanessa was everywhere and nowhere at once. Her mockery in 2018 had been the spark, but what came after was slower, colder. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a campaign of erosion. Christmas Eve, 2019. Dallas was cold that year, an unusual chill that crept into the loading bays. I remember walking through the darkened Grant Logistics HQ that night, bourbon in hand, the fluorescent lights humming faintly. Every office door was closed. Every desk sat empty. The only sound was the security system cycling through its rounds. On my desk in the executive suite, I'd spread out bylaws, shareholder agreements, and a stack of old compliance memos like ghosts of my own making. The redwood meridian slip sat on top of the pile, creased now from my constant handling. Martin Alvarez, my CFO, my oldest ally, poked his head into the office. He wasn't dressed for a holiday party. He was dressed like me, a man who couldn't let things go. "You're losing sleep, not the company," he said quietly, stepping in and closing the door behind him. I didn't let the look up from the papers. What if they said the same thing? He sighed, pulled up a chair. Vanessa Sift is good at playing social chess. Investors love her. But she doesn't sift have the numbers. You do, you Bella's had the numbers. I tapped the redwood slip. She has something. This is septed to noise, Martin. This is structure. She sept is building something offshore. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You think she sits setting up a move? I know she is, I said flatly. The laugh wasn't just a jab. It was a warning I didn't set catch soon enough. 2019. Bled into 2020 like ink in water. Vanessa began subtly reclaiming influence. She'd left the company board formally during the divorce, but her friends hadn't. She started hosting dinners with old investors, consulting for industry panels, even dropping casual hints to Ryan that I was tired and that maybe the company needed fresh vision. It was smart. She didn't attack me head on. She tilted the ground beneath my feet. Meanwhile, I started spending more nights alone at HQ. I wasn't plotting yet. I was just trying to understand how deep the rot went. I'd walk the empty halls at midnight, passing framed photos of our early days, me and Vanessa in our 30s smiling at ribbon cuttings, shaking hands with suppliers, Ryan sitting on my shoulders at a warehouse opening. It was surreal, like watching someone slowly dismantle a house you'd built with your own hands, one brick at a time. Ryan was caught in the middle without even realizing it. He'd call me sometimes on Sunday nights. "Mom says you're burning yourself out," he'd say, his voice hesitant. "She's not wrong." I admit, "Maybe you should let her help," he'd suggest. That stung. Not because he meant harm, he didn't, but because it revealed exactly how Vanessa was framing the narrative. To him it wasn't set betrayal. It was Mom trying to fix Dad's setbed's stubbornness. She was winning the story war, and story is everything in legacy. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started archiving everything. I asked Martin to quietly compile vendor lists and offshore transaction summaries. I requested IT to pull badge entry logs for executives under the guise of security upgrades. I met with legal to review the 2014 proxy clause buried deep in the governance documents, something almost everyone else had forgotten existed. This wasn't scent revenge, not yet. This was reconnaissance. But the nights were still long, and the silence louder than any betrayal. One night in October 2020, I came home late again. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the study. On my desk sat a stack of anonymous shareholder letters. They'd been delivered to HQ earlier that day, forwarded to me by the compliance team. There's such chatter about Vanessa meeting with Redwood contacts again. Rumors of a leadership realignment vote next year. She sips talking like she sips still in charge. I read each one slowly, one after another, and for the first time in 2 years I felt something click inside me. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a campaign, and I'd been too patient, too quiet, thinking I could outwait her. I poured a drink, stared at the flickering desk lamp, and whispered to myself, if she wants to play long games, I settle play longer. By the end of 2020, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was watching, listening, collecting. I'd accepted that Vanessa wasn't going away quietly. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that if this legacy, my legacy, was going to survive, I'd have to stop reacting and start designing. The silence wasn't at crushing me anymore. It was teaching me how to move without making a sound. Revenge doesn't start with rage. It starts with a blueprint, drawn quietly in the dark while everyone else is asleep. By March 2021, Vanessa's boardroom whispers had matured into something more organized. She wasn't just sowing doubts anymore, she was recruiting. I knew it because whistleblowers rarely send emails unless they're scared, and scared people are usually right. It was a Tuesday late afternoon, when Martin forwarded me an encrypted email with the subject line, Vanessa, confidential meetings. The sender was anonymous but used our internal compliance portal. Inside was a series of meeting notes copied from a personal assistant who worked for one of Vanessa's old allies, Victor Lang, a board member who'd always loved the sound of his own voice. The notes were dated February 17, 2021. Hotel Crescent Court, Dallas. Vanessa met with Victor +2 outside investors. Topic: Leadership Transition Strategy for Grant Logistics. Phrase used: the old man sips is losing his grip. Cayman accounts mentioned twice. I remember reading that line, the old man's losing his grip, and feeling my jaw tighten slowly like a vice. She wasn't just mocking me anymore, she was positioning me for removal. And that whistleblower email? That was the match hitting the kindling I'd been quietly piling for 2 years. Around that same time, Julia Carter entered my life. She wasn't part of some grand plan at first. She was just a legal consultant I met at a logistics compliance seminar in Houston. Brilliant, grounded, 10 years younger than me, with the kind of sharp mind that makes you rethink every sloppy assumption you've ever had. We started talking professionally: corporate structure, proxy mechanisms, offshore compliance vulnerabilities. And then one evening, over burnt coffee in the hotel lobby, she asked me casually, have you ever actually read your 2014 proxy clause recently? I frowned. Not since it was drafted. Why? She pulled up the clause on her tablet. Section 8.3, buried deep in the bylaws. In the event of incapacitation or material risk to corporate governance, controlling shares may be reassigned temporarily via proxy escrow to a designated agent, subject to pre-authorization by the founder. She glanced at me. Vanessa forgot the game. You wrote the rules. I stared at the screen. I had written that clause myself in 2014 after a brief cancer scare. It was meant as a contingency, a shield. Vanessa had probably forgotten it existed. I hadn't a stat. Not anymore. By late 2021, the outlines of what Martin later nicknamed the Gate Plan started to form. I called Martin into my office one evening after everyone had left. The city lights poured through the glass like molten gold. She sips planning a coup, I said simply. He didn't argue. He'd seen the whistleblower email too. I want to prepare a legal firewall, I continued. No theatrics, no noise, just airtight documents. Martin leaned back in his chair. You said finally going on offense. No, I said quietly. I said I'm just closing the gates before she storms them. We started with 3 pillars. Compliance: map it, trace Redwood Meridian's money flow. Governance: triggers, reactivate and modernize the 2014 proxy clause. Board influence: charting, map Vanessa's remaining allies and their pressure points. Julia became a crucial part of this. She joined the legal team officially in January 2022, and by then she and I were more than colleagues. She became my personal counsel, and eventually something more personal. Every act of betrayal leaves evidence. You just have to gather it before it burns. In April 2022, Julia and I spent nights in my study combing through vendor contracts, email archives, and shareholder communications. One night, she slid a folder across the table. Inside were financial tracing reports Martin's team had compiled. Redwood Meridian received 5 transfers, she said, totaling $2.8 million between August 2018 and December 2020, all routed through Cayman, all initiated by a consulting shell Vanessa set up post-divorce. I nodded slowly. And the board? They don't know yet, but Victor Sip's been briefed. He sips lining up investors. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was fact. Then came Lyle Briggs, a former police investigator turned private PI. Lyle had a reputation for being relentless but completely lawful. No cheap tricks, no illegal wiretaps, just patience, observation, and paperwork. I hired him quietly in June 2022 to follow the offshore money, Vanessa's travel, and boardroom alliances. By autumn, he delivered a neat binder of PI logs, meetings, dates, transcripts of overheard investor pitches, even photographs of Vanessa at investor dinners. Every piece fit together. She was building her army. I was building my fortress. By December 2022, the gate plan was complete. A proxy escrow draft sat locked in my safe. Compliance audits were underway without tipping anyone off. And every single Redwood Meridian transaction had a corresponding timestamp, document, or witness. In the quiet of my study, I stared at the blueprint pinned to the corkboard. Vanessa thought she was assembling a coup. What she didn't know was that she'd already stepped onto a chessboard I'd designed years ago, and I was done waiting. When you decide to go to war without announcing it, your first move isn't loud, it's quiet, precise, and irreversible. By March 2023, the gate plan was no longer just notes pinned on a corkboard. It was becoming reality, one quiet maneuver at a time. The first visible change came on April 6, 2023. That morning, while most employees were still nursing their coffees, our security contractor rolled into HQ with new digital lock systems. I'd authorized a full access reset, new fobs, reissued IDs, updated clearance hierarchies. Officially, it was part of a post-pandemic security modernization initiative. Unofficially, it was the first gate closing. By noon, the system had gone live. Badge logs later showed 3 failed entries at executive-level doors that same afternoon, 2 from Victor Lang, 1 from Vanessa herself. She wasn't technically on the board anymore, but she still had residual badge privileges from her consultant role. I had those privileges revoked quietly 2 days later. When she called Martin to ask what was going on, his answer was smooth, practiced. Routine upgrades, Vanessa. It SEP's tightening security company-wide. She didn't buy it entirely, but she couldn't prove otherwise. Meanwhile, Martin's compliance team had quietly started tracking vendor payments connected to Vanessa's Redwood Meridian network. On April 18th, he came into my office carrying a thin folder. His expression was calm, but I knew that look. It meant he'd found something. Another $400,000 transfer, he said, dropping the folder on my desk. 2 shell vendors in Cayman. She sips using them to quietly buy influence. Consulting fees, my ass. I flipped through the invoices, each dated between January and March 2023, all cleverly disguised as logistics innovation consulting. They spore pre-positioning, Martin added. She sips, greasing the wheels for a leadership realignment. I leaned back slowly. Good. Let her keep spending. The more she moves, the clearer her trail becomes. Every transfer was another receipt to file, another stone in the wall I was building around her. While Martin traced the money, Julia focused on legal fortification. By May 2023, she had drafted the proxy escrow agreements that would become the linchpin of my strategy. The documents were meticulous. My controlling shares could be temporarily transferred to Julia as proxy in case of material governance risk. The escrow would remain sealed and inactive unless triggered by a predefined condition, any hostile takeover or leadership realignment initiated without my consent. Once triggered, the proxy activated instantly and board control shifted legally and irreversibly. I remember one late night in my study, Julia sliding the draft across the table. If she tries to move, this is the lever that flips the boardroom upside down, she said. I ran my fingers along the signatures line, and she won see it coming. Julia smiled faintly. She never checked the old rules. She seps too busy writing new ones. Ryan came to visit unexpectedly in June 2023. He said to been working on a sustainability project in Austin and wanted to talk. We sat on the back porch one humid Saturday evening, bourbon in hand, crickets loud enough to fill the silences. Dad, he started slowly. Mom sips, meeting people. Big names. She was at a dinner in Dallas last week. Investors, some board people. She sounded different, confident. I didn't then react outwardly. What did she say? He hesitated. She said the company deserves modern leadership, that you Septive had your time. So. The words weren't new to me, but hearing them from Ryan was different. I looked at him carefully. He wasn't trying to betray anyone. He was torn. I just don't want to see the company torn apart, he said quietly. It won't set be, I replied. My voice steady. I promise you that. Meanwhile, Lyle Briggs kept sending me weekly binders. His logs from July 2023 documented Vanessa Sepp's movements with clinical precision. Investor dinners at the Adolphus. Closed-door strategy sessions with Victor. A quiet trip to New York to meet potential leadership partners. Every binder had dates, photos, overheard fragments of conversations. She sits lining up her troops. Lyle told me over the phone one night, but she sits moving too publicly. She sits getting cocky. Good, I thought. Cocky people make mistakes. By August 2023, we drafted shareholder consent letters, the formal documents that would execute immediate board changes if my proxy were triggered. Martin, Julia, and I met in the executive conference room late one Friday night. The building was empty except for the cleaning crew humming down the hall. Once these are delivered, Martin said, tapping the stack, there seps no going back. That seps the point, I replied. We prepared sealed envelopes, each numbered and time-stamped, ready to be hand-delivered the day of activation. Every signature was lined up. Every legal detail cross-checked. The fortress was nearly complete. By September 2023, I stepped back and surveyed what we'd built. Physical access tightened. Financial tracing airtight. Legal proxy locked and escrowed. Board consents prepared. Intelligence flowing weekly. Vanessa had no idea. She was busy building momentum for her takeover, and I was quietly locking every gate she didn't know existed. Some wars are won not by the strongest army, but by the quietest move on the board, a single piece sliding into place while your opponent is too busy enjoying the applause. By early 2024, Vanessa believed she was untouchable. Her investor dinners were more frequent, her allies louder, and her sense of inevitability was practically radiating from her every move. But she didn't realize that while she was charming the room, I'd already placed my queen exactly where it needed to be. February 19th, 2024. Julie and I sat together in the legal conference room just after sunset. Dallas traffic hummed faintly below the windows. On the table between us lay a crisp proxy document, the very one we had drafted back in 2022 and perfected through 2023. This is it, Julia said softly, sliding the Mont Blanc pen toward me. I picked it up slowly, savoring the moment. Once I sign this, there's no room for improvisation, I said. That seps the point, she replied. The game will play out exactly the way we designed it. I signed the document with a deliberate stroke. Proxy executed, effective upon escrow release. Julia countersigned, then sealed the document in a secure escrow envelope, dated and notarized. The trigger date was set October 11th, 2024. The date Vanessa's camp was quietly planning their leadership realignment vote. Lyle's logs and Martin's intel had confirmed it weeks earlier. They thought they were building toward their big day. They didn't realize I was already sitting 3 moves ahead. In March 2024, Vanessa organized what she called a strategic vision retreat at a boutique resort outside Austin. Officially, it was meant to align leadership perspectives for the next decade. Unofficially, it was a loyalty parade. Julia and I didn't attend, of course, but Lyle did, quietly. He booked a room under a pseudonym, and for 3 days he sat in lounges, overheard dinners, and quietly documented every alliance Vanessa tried to forge. His report landed on my desk the following week. Vanessa spent the first night working the investor tables like a politician on the campaign trail. She hosted a private fireside chat with Victor Lang and two hedge fund reps. She floated phrases like next generation leadership and visionary modernization. Ryan was there, not as a conspirator, but as someone she clearly wanted to bring to her side. She knew that if she could win Ryan emotionally, she could paint me as the outdated patriarch. But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't fighting for ego. I was fighting for the company's survival. When Ryan came to see me on April 2nd, 2024, I knew the conversation would hurt before he even opened his mouth. We sat in my office, sunlight slanting through the blinds. He looked older now, more confident, but the conflict in his eyes was unmistakable. Dad, he started slowly. Mom Sip's not the enemy. I let the silence hang, letting him fill it. She just wants respect back. She built this company with you. She doesn't want to destroy it. I leaned forward, elbows on my desk. Ryan, do you honestly believe that, after everything she's been doing for the past 5 years? He hesitated. She thinks the company Sip's stuck. She thinks she can modernize it faster than you, such are willing to. I exhaled slowly, choosing my words carefully. This company is just a toy. It sits a legacy, and legacies don't sit survive charm offensives. They survive structure, discipline, and integrity. He looked down, conflicted. I softened my voice. Ryan, you don't have to choose sides today. But one day soon, you still see what's really happening. And when that day comes, I need you to remember this conversation. He nodded slowly. I just don't want a war. I looked at him steadily. Warsip's already here. You just haven't seen the first shot yet. By May and June 2024, Vanessa's behavior had become almost theatrical. She gave interviews to trade publications about innovation and leadership, dropped cryptic comments at conferences, and started referring to herself as a strategic visionary again. She believed her moment was inevitable. Lyle Sepp's weekly binders became almost comical. Pages filled with Vanessa holding court at poolside bars, laughing with investors, making grand promises about October. One night around 1 a.m., labeling another binder for storage, I muttered to myself, "Keep talking, Vanessa. Every word writes your ending." By August 2024, Julia had finalized every legal angle. She conducted mock board sessions, reviewed escrow activation protocols, and coordinated with Martin to ensure that financial disclosures were ready to drop the moment Vanessa made her move. This isn't about drama, she reminded me late one night in my study. This is about precision. When the hammer drops, it has to drop clean. I nodded. It will. By the end of September, all the pieces were exactly where they needed to be. Proxy signed and escrowed. Board consents prepared. Legal protocols rehearsed. Financial evidence cataloged. Vanessa confidently walking into a trap she couldn't even see. She believed October 11th would be her coronation. I knew it would be her checkmate. There's a certain heaviness that settles over Dallas in September. It's not just the heat, it's the kind that sticks to your skin, seeps into your thoughts, and makes everything feel slower, heavier, inevitable. That's exactly how the weeks before Vanessa's October 11th coup attempt felt. Heavy, quiet, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks the sky open. It started on September 5th, 2024, with a seemingly small mistake. Martin forwarded me an internal calendar invite that had made its way through the corporate grapevine. Leadership vote, Octelf, 2004 und 20. 0 Appunktmann's boardroom. No sender listed. No official notice. Just a mysterious event on the board calendar. Julia read it twice and looked up slowly. They leaked it, she said flatly. Not leaked, I corrected, planted. They want people to start whispering. And whisper they did. By the next morning, two department heads asked Martin if I was stepping down. They were playing the perception game early. I had expected this, but not this soon. On September 14th, around 11:30 p.m., Ryan showed up at my house unannounced. He looked like he hadn't slept. "I need to know what's going on," he said, standing in the doorway. We moved to the study, the one lined with framed logistics patents and old family photos. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Ryan paced like a man caught between two storms. "Dad, are you protecting the company? Or are you punishing Mom?" His question hit harder than he probably expected. I leaned back slowly, choosing my words. "Both," I said finally. "But one ends up helping you." He stopped pacing. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound like you set planning a war, not running a company." I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark Dallas skyline. "Ryan, your mother started this war years ago. I just made sure it wouldn't set in with her winning by default." He exhaled sharply. "She thinks you stirred trying to erase her." I turned to face him. "No. She sibs erasing herself. I subs am just making sure the company survives the fallout." The next 2 weeks were a blur of controlled movements. Julia triple-checked the escrow proxy activation protocols. Martin finalized the shareholder consents and lined up courier logistics for October 11th at 8:58 a.m. sharp. Lyle kept his eyes on Vanessa's investor meetings, logging every movement, every whisper. On September 22nd, Julia came into my office with a thick legal binder and dropped it onto my desk with a thud. "This is everything," she said. "No gaps, no surprises." I flipped through it. Every trigger, every clause, every step had been anticipated. "We set her ready," I said quietly. She looked at me for a long moment. "Are you?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, readiness and peace are two different things, and I had one but not the other. By the last week of September, the rumors had matured into certainty. I overheard snippets in hallways, caught sideways glances in meetings, and saw the way board members clustered in quiet corners after sessions. She Scepter's going to make a move. Big changes coming in October. I heard Victor already has a modernization plan. They didn't realize that I had already mapped every one of their moves, like pawns marching straight into a trap. But that didn't make the waiting any easier. On the night of October 10th, 2024, I barely slept. I sat in my study until nearly 3 a.m., staring at the wall of evidence I'd built over the years. Receipts, logs, affidavits, shareholder documents, all neatly organized in boxes labeled by year. Vanessa's laughter from that night in 2018 at the Mercury Grill echoed in my mind like a looped recording. Back then, I'd driven home through the Dallas streets, gripping the steering wheel, realizing it wasn't just mockery, it was strategy. Tonight, 6 years later, her strategy was about to crash into mine. Julia texted me at 12:47 a.m. "Everything in place. See you in the morning." Martin sent a brief follow-up. "Courier confirmed. 80:58 sharp." And Ryan? He didn't text. But that silence spoke louder than any message. October 11th, 2024. Dallas mornings in October are deceptive. The air is cool, but the sun still burns. I arrived at HQ before dawn. The parking lot was empty, the building dark except for security lights. I walked through the lobby slowly, letting my footsteps echo. In my office, everything was set exactly as planned. The proxy escrow activation letter sat sealed in its folder. The shareholder consent packets were arranged by delivery order. My phone was face down, silent. I poured myself a black coffee and stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the city. This was the final moment of quiet before everything shifted. Some mornings feel like they're carved into your bones long before they happen. October 11th, 2024 was one of those mornings. I arrived at the headquarters just after 6:30 a.m. The sun was still low, the building unusually still. Every step I took through the quiet hallways sounded sharper, like the air itself knew what was coming. I'd replayed this day in my mind for months. Every clause, every minute, every signature. But there's a difference between imagining a storm and standing in its eye. Julia arrived at 8:15, looking focused, hair tied back, binder in hand. Martin followed 5 minutes later, carrying the shareholder consent packets like precious cargo. We gathered briefly in my office. No speeches, no dramatic music, just three people who knew exactly what had to happen. At 8:45 a.m., Julia placed the sealed proxy escrow packet on my desk. "This is the moment," she said quietly. I broke the seal. Inside was the signed proxy activation letter, dated and notarized months earlier, along with a single line in Julia Sepp's precise handwriting. "The Queen moves now." I signed the activation release with deliberate slowness. Julia slipped the letter into a red folder marked ES0 activation, immediate, then walked it to legal counsel's office 2 doors down. The company's external counsel, McAllister and Boyd LLP, were waiting with their own witnesses. At 8:53 a.m., the letter was logged. At 8:56 a.m., the board secretary received a formal notice. At 8:58 a.m., Martin handed the courier a bundle of numbered shareholder consent packets. Each was time-stamped to the second. The trap was officially sprung. By 9 o'clock, the boardroom was buzzing. Vanessa swept in wearing a cream blazer and that practiced smile that had once charmed rooms full of investors. Victor Lang trailed close behind, phone in hand like a general carrying battle plans. She scanned the room with a mix of triumph and calculation. She saw me sitting calmly at the head of the table, Julia on my right, Martin on my left. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hesitation cross her face. Not panic, just the faint realization that maybe this wouldn't be the cakewalk she expected. The meeting opened with procedural formalities. Vanessa wasted no time seizing the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, rising to her feet with the confidence of someone who believed history was about to favor her. She launched into her speech like she rehearsed it for months, about modernizing leadership, about aligning with visionary partners, about respecting the legacy but embracing the future. She sprinkled in buzzwords like confetti, synergy, transformation, leadership pivot. Ryan sat halfway down the table, expression unreadable. Vanessa looked around the room as if she were already chairwoman. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. I wanted every word of her self-coronation on the record. When she finally paused for breath, Julia gave me the faintest nod. "Madam Chair," Julia said, her voice calm, "before any motions proceed, the board should acknowledge the activation of the controlling proxy." The room froze. Vanessa blinked. "What proxy?" Julia slid a single-page document across the table toward legal counsel. McAllister and Boyd Sipp's lead attorney adjusted his glasses and read the header aloud. "Notice of activation, proxy agreement dated February 19, 2024. He cleared his throat. "Under the 2014 corporate bylaws, section 5.4, this proxy supersedes all standard voting structures, effective immediately upon activation." Vanessa's face drained of color, as if someone had pulled the rug from under her perfectly arranged narrative. "This is absurd," she snapped. "This concepted—" "It can." Julia cut in smoothly. "And it has. As of 8:53 a.m. this morning." The attorney nodded. "Confirmed. The controlling proxy has been activated. Effective immediately, voting control rests with Mrs. Julia Carter Grant, designated proxy holder." Gasps. Actual gasps. Right on cue, Martin stood up. "If I may," he said evenly. He began distributing shareholder consent packets one by one, each sealed, each containing the signed consents removing Vanessa's allies from their interim advisory positions. The timestamp on each envelope? 8:58 a.m. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Victor Lang tried to intervene, whispering frantically to two board members. But their faces told the story. They'd just realized they were standing on a collapsing bridge. Julia wasn't done. She opened her binder and slid out compliance packets, the very ones Martin's team had built over the past 2 years. Inside each packet, Cayman shell transfer receipts totaling $2.8 million, PI logs documenting strategy meetings, whistleblower emails from Vanessa's own assistant, vendor payments linked to Redwood Meridian LLC. "This," Julia said calmly, "is why the proxy was created in the first place." Legal counsel flipped through the pages, their expressions tightening with each document. Vanessa tried to regain control. This is a personal vendetta, she hissed. This isn't Senate governance. This is theater. No, I said finally, my voice cutting through the room like a clean blade. This is accountability. All eyes turned toward Ryan. He hadn't said a word until now. He looked at Vanessa, then at me. I saw the exact moment the pieces clicked in his mind. The investor dinners, the whispered promises, my quiet preparations. He didn't stand or make a speech. He just leaned back slowly, exhaled, and looked at his mother with a kind of sorrow that said everything words couldn't. That moment hit her harder than any legal maneuver. Vanessa tried one last desperate move. I call for a leadership vote, she demanded, slamming her hand on the table. Legal counsel responded flatly. Your motion is void. Proxy control supersedes. She looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back her. No one did. For years she'd thrived on charm, momentum, and fear, but against structure, foresight, and documented evidence, she had nothing. Her shoulders sank. Her voice faltered. This isn't set over, she whispered. Oh, it is, I replied softly. And you wrote the ending yourself. By the time the meeting adjourned, Vanessa's coup had completely disintegrated. Her allies were neutralized, her credibility shredded, her face pale with the realization that she'd been outmaneuvered on her own stage. As I walked out of the boardroom, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The wall I set to built over 6 years had held. The boardroom ambush ended like a thunderclap, but the real storm hid in the quiet that followed. While the others filed out with murmured conversations and shaken expressions, I stayed behind for a few moments, letting the silence settle like dust after an explosion. It was over in the boardroom. But between Vanessa and me, the reckoning was just beginning. The confrontation didn't happen in some grand stage. It happened in the East Wing corridor, outside the executive lounge, a long stretch of marble and glass that caught the late morning Dallas sun just right. I was heading back to my office when I heard the sharp echo of heels on the floor. Wilder! Her voice snapped like a whip. I turned slowly. Vanessa stood a few steps away, cream blazer immaculate, but her posture cracked, not broken, not yet, but fractured in a way I hadn't seen since before the divorce. You planned this for years, she said, striding closer. Her tone was controlled, but her eyes were pure fire. No, I replied evenly. I prepared. You wrote this script the night you mocked me. She stopped right in front of me. Her jaw tightened. You humiliated me. No, I said calmly. You tried to rewrite the company SEP's future for your ego. I just turned on the lights. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You couldn't stand that I still had power, that people still listened to me. You wanted to erase me. I let her words hang in the air. Erase you? I repeated. You were the one who tried to carve me out of my own legacy. You built a coup on Cayman shells and charmed dinners. This wasn't set personal, Vanessa. This was structural. She laughed bitterly. You always hide behind structure, behind rules that sets why you sense or alone. I didn't flinch. Rules built this company. Your games nearly burned it down. For a split second, I saw something flicker behind her anger. Not regret, never that, but the sting of a move gone wrong. Neither of us noticed Ryan at first. He'd come down the hall quietly, probably on his way to find me, but when he heard us, he stopped a few yards away, watching. Vanessa noticed him a moment later. Her voice softened instantly, turning sharp edges into honey. Ryan, she said, reaching a hand toward him. You saw what they did. You saw how your father. He didn't move toward her. He didn't move toward me either. He just stood there watching us like a man seeing two very different truths collide. Mom, he said slowly. I saw everything. Vanessa froze. His voice was steady. I saw the packets, the receipts, the investors. I saw it all. Her hand dropped. That moment wasn't dramatic like a movie. It was quiet, brutal, and final. She realized she'd lost the company. But in that instant, she also realized she'd lost him. Vanessa turned back to me. Her voice was quieter now, but every word was laced with venom. You think this is justice? She hissed. This is just your ego dressed up in legalese. No, I said softly. This is balance. You built your house on quicksand and expected me to drown with you. I just stepped off the foundation before it collapsed. Her eyes flashed. You self-regret this. I stepped closer, not menacing, just close enough that she could see I wasn't shaken. I already did, I said. Back in 2018, the night you laughed across that table. That was the night you stopped being my partner. Today was just the paperwork catching up. For the first time that day, Vanessa didn't have a comeback. Ryan walked up beside me, not behind me, beside me. Vanessa's eyes widened. Ryan, don't set do this. He looked at her with heartbreaking calm. I said I'm not doing anything, Mom. You did this. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply true. And in that truth, the last fragile thread between them snapped. She turned away abruptly, heels striking the marble like gunshots. She didn't look back. Ryan stood silently next to me, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. She seeps angry, he murmured. She seeps lost, I corrected. He nodded slowly. I get it now. As we walked back toward my office together, the building felt different, lighter, quieter. Years of whispered schemes and strategic positioning had finally met daylight. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan and I walked side by side without a wall of unspoken tension between us. This wasn't victory in the cinematic sense. There were no trumpets, no applause, but it was justice. Quiet, heavy, inevitable. The thing about explosions is that they're loud, sudden, and unmistakable. But the real clarity comes in the silence after. When the smoke hangs in the air and you finally see what's still standing and what isn't. The boardroom coup was a single morning. The fallout lasted months. The first to move were the press. By October 13th, 2024, barely 48 hours after the ambush, the Dallas Herald ran a headline, Power Shift at Grant Logistics. Founder triggers proxy to block leadership coup. The article was dry, almost surgical. No sensationalism, just a clean recounting of what happened. The proxy activation, the shareholder consents, the removal of Vanessa's allies, the compliance evidence. But the implications were massive. Other outlets followed suit. The Wall Street Ledger, Bloomberg Logistics Weekly, even a few national business podcasts. Vanessa wasn't named as antagonist outright, but the narrative was clear, a failed modernization coup thwarted by ironclad legal structure. Investors hate instability, and Vanessa had just become the face of instability. By late October, several of Vanessa's investor contacts started quietly backing away. Lyle Sepp's reports were sharp. Two hedge fund reps who'd courted Vanessa at the Austin retreat formally pulled their interest. A New York logistics VC canceled their strategic partnership talks. Even Victor Lang began ghosting her messages. She had gambled everything on momentum. When that momentum collapsed, so did her support. Martin put it best during a finance call on October 27th. She built her army on handshakes and smiles. You built yours on signatures and structure, their sips, no contest. Early November 2024, Vanessa's remaining allies began to step down quietly. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fiery resignations or grand speeches, just quiet, efficient withdrawals. Victor Lang cited personal reasons in his resignation letter. Two advisory board members returned their retainers. A third sent a curt email. This is no longer strategically viable. Julia collected every resignation letter, dated, and filed them neatly in a red binder labeled Aftermath. Like leaves falling after a storm, she said one night in my study. She was right. One by one, the structures Vanessa had built crumbled, not with a bang, but with silence. In mid-November, Ryan came by my office one evening. The building was quiet, most employees gone for the day. He leaned against the doorframe, hands in his jacket pockets. You played the long game, he said simply. I looked up from my desk. No, I replied. I protected what you still inherit. He stepped inside slowly. I used to think you were just stubborn, like you were stuck in the past. I smiled faintly. Maybe I was, but the past built this company, and sometimes the only way to protect the future is to respect the foundation. He nodded slowly. Mom doesn't see it that way. I know, I said quietly. She saw legacy as leverage. I see it as responsibility. For the first time, he didn't push back. He just stood there looking at the family portraits on the wall, the old framed first invoice from 1998, the patent certificates. Maybe it's time I start learning more, he said finally. Something shifted in that moment. Not dramatic, but real. Late November into December was about rebuilding stability. Julia finalized legal reforms that tightened board nomination protocols. Martin restructured two vendor contracts that Vanessa had quietly undermined. I held a series of closed-door meetings with key investors to reassure them personally. The message was clear. The company wasn't fractured. It had just undergone a necessary surgery. And surprisingly, the market responded positively. By December 19, 2024, our stock had not only stabilized, it had ticked upward 4.3% from pre-ambush levels. It wasn't said a miracle. It was structure. Through all of this, Vanessa remained publicly silent. No statements, no interviews, no fiery social media posts. She retreated into a kind of strategic quiet. I could tell she was regrouping, but without allies or momentum, there wasn't much she could do. Lyle occasionally sent me brief updates spotted at cafes, occasional meetings with minor consultants, but nothing threatening. The woman who had once laughed across the table and called me a bad businessman was now a ghost in the periphery. On the last workday before Christmas, I walked the quiet hallways of the HQ after everyone had left. The lights were dim, the air smelled faintly of pine from the lobby decorations, and the glass walls reflected the Dallas skyline like dark water. This was the same building where Vanessa and I had once built dreams side by side. And now, years later, I'd defended those dreams against her. I wasn't proud in the gloating sense, but I was satisfied. The smoke had cleared, the names had fallen, and the legacy still stood. There's a peculiar silence in courtrooms before hearings begin, the kind that isn't peaceful. It's charged like static before a lightning strike. February 6th, 2025, Dallas County Civil Court. 6 years after Vanessa laughed across that restaurant table, we stood on opposite sides again. But this time there were no white tablecloths, no smirks, no backroom schemes, just law, and the sound of a bailiff calling the docket. Vanessa had avoided public statements for months, but she couldn't avoid the civil liability proceedings triggered by the compliance evidence. The company pet's legal team, led by Julia, had filed for damages and injunctive relief in November 2024. The evidence was airtight. $2.8 million in shell transfers. Whistleblower testimonies. Board meeting minutes documenting undisclosed investor lobbying. Her proxy bypass strategy notes, uncovered by Lyle's surveillance logs. Vanessa Sepp's lawyers tried to frame it as a misunderstanding between former spouses with shared history. The judge wasn't amused. The real action happened behind closed doors. 2 days before the scheduled evidentiary hearing, Vanessa's attorneys approached Julia for settlement discussions. Julia called me late that night. She said scared, she said flatly. I didn't gloat, I just nodded to myself. I'd been waiting for this call for years, not because I wanted revenge in a courtroom, but because I wanted closure with documentation. The settlement negotiations took 12 grueling hours spread over 2 days. Vanessa wanted face-saving language. Julia wanted enforceable terms. I wanted the truth on paper. By the evening of February 5th, we reached a draft agreement. Vanessa would pay $699,842 in restitution to the company. She would accept a 5-year bar from serving as a director or advisor to any Grant Logistics Board entity. She would agree not to contact investors or employees for solicitation. And, crucially, she would sign a no disparagement clause. She fought that last one bitterly, but she signed it. Even though the case settled, the court required a brief hearing to enter the agreement into the public record. Vanessa walked into the courtroom wearing a dark blazer and oversized sunglasses, like that could hide the reality of what was happening. Julia and I sat at our table, calm, focused. The judge reviewed the settlement terms aloud, line by line. When he reached the restitution figure, Vanessa's jaw clenched visibly. This court finds the settlement fair and binding, the judge declared, his gavel striking wood with a decisive crack. It was over. Not in a cinematic blaze of glory, but in black ink on white paper stamped and filed. Even with the settlement, the court required a short testimony from me for the record. I walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, swore the oath, and looked out across the courtroom. Vanessa didn't meet my eyes. She stared straight ahead. Julia Sepp's questions were simple, factual. Did I activate the proxy legally? Yes. Was the evidence regarding the Cayman transfers accurate? Yes. Did Vanessa have opportunities to disclose conflicts? Multiple, I answered calmly, each word deliberate. Then Julia asked the final question. Mr. Grant, did you intend to harm Mrs. Grant personally through these actions? I looked at the judge, then at Vanessa, and said clearly, no, I didn't just destroy her. She built the fall herself. I just made sure it happened in daylight. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter paused briefly before typing. After the hearing, I stepped into the courthouse hallway. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Reporters hovered at a respectful distance, scribbling notes. Julia joined me a moment later, binder under her arm. It's that's done, she said softly. I nodded. Yeah, finally. For years, Vanessa had played in Shadow's backroom dinners, whispered promises, proxy end runs. Today, those shadows were dragged into daylight, and the law didn't blink. As we walked out of the courthouse together, I thought back to 2018, that night at the Mercury Grill, her laughter, the Cayman slip, the drive home through Dallas with my hands clenched on the wheel. Back then, I decided not to fight fire with fire. I met a fight strategy with structure. And standing on those courthouse steps, I realized it worked. The gavel had fallen. The ghost of that night was finally buried. There's a room in my house that no one else really goes into. It's tucked away behind the library, a small study with floor-to-ceiling shelves, two leather chairs, and a single window that looks out over the backyard. After the court case ended in February, I found myself spending more and more time there. Not working, not planning, just sitting. For years I'd lived in forward motion, building, defending, countering, but when the storm finally passed, the silence felt almost foreign. In March 2025, Julia and I started clearing out old company files from my home office. I'd kept nearly everything from the past decade. Every proxy draft, every Cayman receipt, every legal memo. One afternoon, while she sorted through binders, I carried 3 cardboard boxes into the quiet room and set them down by the wall. Each box was labeled by hand. 2018, 2019, the spark. 2020-22, the planning. 2023-2025, the war. I opened the first box. Inside were printed bank statements, photographs, whistleblower emails, and that crumpled $2.8 million wire slip that had fallen from Vanessa's purse at the Mercury Grill all those years ago. I held it in my hands for a long time. The ink had faded slightly, but the date, June 14th, 2018, was still crisp. That was the night everything changed. I sat in the leather chair and caught a glimpse of myself in the small wall mirror. 6 years. The man staring back wasn't the same one who'd gripped the steering wheel on that warm Dallas night, shaking with anger and disbelief. This man had seen boardroom coups, legal chess matches, family fractures, and courtroom gavel strikes. His hair was grayer, his eyes steadier. He looked tired but whole. Sometimes revenge stories end with fireworks. Mine ended with a mirror and 3 cardboard boxes. One evening, Julia came in with 2 glasses of whiskey and sat across from me. She watched me silently for a while before finally asking, "Do you ever wonder if you did all this to prove her wrong or to find peace?" I stared at the box labeled "The Spark." Both, I admitted. In the beginning, I wanted to prove her wrong. Every move she made, every insult, every scheme, it fueled me. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about her. Julia tilted her head. And became about what? Legacy, I said. This company isn't set just numbers on paper. It sets my father Sepp's lessons, my late nights, our team Sepp's work, Ryan Sepp's future. She tried to gamble all that for ego. She raised her glass. Then you didn't set lose anything. You kept it intact. I smiled faintly. You didn't lose me, you gave me away, I whispered, repeating the thought that had lived in my head for months. Julia leaned forward and kissed my forehead gently. You finally said it. In May 2025, Ryan stopped by unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon. He walked into the quiet room, looked at the stacks of boxes, and gave a low whistle. Looks like a war archive. It is, I said simply. He sat down opposite me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that caught me off guard. I used to think you were paranoid, like you were holding on too tight. Now I realize you were holding it together. His words hit me harder than I expected. Ryan had always been the bridge between us, torn, skeptical, young, but now he spoke like a man who had seen the battlefield and understood the cost. You don't have to carry this forever, he said quietly, nodding toward the boxes. I know, I replied, but I had to carry it long enough. As spring deepened, I began spending early mornings in the quiet room with coffee instead of legal briefs. No more midnight proxy rehearsals. No more investor surveillance. No more whispered warnings. Just birdsong, the smell of old paper, and the feeling of finally owning my story instead of reacting to someone else's. I thought about Vanessa sometimes, not with hatred but with a strange kind of distance, like remembering a storm that once terrified you but now just leaves puddles on the sidewalk. She wasn't a villain in a comic book. She was a woman who made selfish choices and underestimated someone who wouldn't break. And I was a man who finally stopped needing to win because I'd already won by surviving. Some endings don't happen with a bang. They happen quietly, when the future starts to move again after years of standing still. By the autumn of 2025, life had stopped feeling like a chess match. The storm had passed. The walls I'd built had held. And for the first time in a long time, I started thinking not about what I was defending, but what I could build next. Vanessa tried to start something new that summer. Word reached us through the usual channels. Lyle Seps's PI updates. Industry whispers that she had launched a consulting startup aimed at modern logistics transformation. She reached out to a few of her old investor contacts, floated some big visions, pitched herself as a strategic visionary, free from the constraints of old structures. But investors have long memories. One hedge fund partner told a mutual contact, "We Googled her." The board coup story still comes up on page 1. Her reputation followed her like a shadow that wouldn't shrink. Meetings were polite but short. Calls went unanswered. By September 2025, her startup was little more than a website and a couple of LinkedIn posts with single-digit likes. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The consequences were doing their quiet work. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Ryan scheduled a meeting with me and Julia for October 2nd, 2025. He walked into my office with a slim folder and the kind of nervous energy I recognized from my own early years. "I've been working on something," he said, placing the folder on my desk. Inside was a comprehensive sustainability initiative, new green logistics corridors, electrified fleet proposals, carbon offset partnerships. "This is how we take grant logistics into the next generation," he said. Julia and I read through the proposal carefully. It was sharp, ambitious, and thoughtful. "You'd been busy," I said. He grinned. "I figured at Sep's time I stopped standing in doorways and started building something." For the first time, I saw not the boy torn between parents, but the man ready to inherit a legacy. Julia was instrumental in shaping this new phase. She'd been my strategist, my legal shield, and eventually my partner through all of it. But now she shifted roles again, from defender to builder. She helped Ryan refine his proposal, connected him with regulatory advisors, and laid out the governance structure needed to integrate his sustainability vision without destabilizing the core company. One night, as we reviewed the documents together at home, she looked at me and said, "You spent years protecting this house. Maybe now it sets time to renovate." She was right. The war was over. It was time to build. One crisp evening in late October 2025, the three of us, me, Julia, and Ryan, stood on the 18th floor balcony of HQ, looking out over the Dallas skyline. The city glowed gold against the deepening twilight, planes tracing thin lines overhead. This view never gets old, Ryan said softly. I nodded. Neither does the feeling of knowing it still yours. He glanced at me, a quiet smile on his face. Bad businessman, huh? Julia laughed softly and leaned against me. I chuckled. The best kind. For years that phrase had been a wound. Now it was just a joke shared between survivors. Legacy isn't a static thing carved in stone. It's rewritten every day by the choices you make and the people you trust to carry them forward. For me, legacy used to mean control, structure, walls. Now it meant trusting Ryan to carry what I'd built without turning it into a weapon. It meant building new roads instead of constantly reinforcing old gates. And maybe, just maybe, it meant finally letting myself breathe. On the last day of November, I walked the HQ halls alone after sunset. The building was quiet, the offices dark, the city lights shimmering through the glass walls. I paused by the portrait of the original Grant logistics team, me, Vanessa, and Martin, the first 10 employees, all standing awkwardly in suits 25 years too big. For a moment, I felt a strange kind of peace. Everything had changed. And yet, the heart of it was still there. This wasn't set a victory lap. It was closure. The story that started in betrayal and boardroom battles ended not with revenge, but with renewal.